The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be talking about the gender gap and its implications for social relationships as well as political realignment. And to help us do that, we've got two really great guests. Christine Emba is author of a wonderful book called Rethinking Sex, a Provocation. She is a New York Times contributor. And Aaron Renn, our old friend, who is a writer and author of Life in the Negative World. You can follow him at aaronrenn.com. Christine, Aaron, welcome.
So why don't we just start off with this? Maybe, Christine, we can start with you. Is it just our imagination, or is the gap between men and women now wider than it had been traditionally?
It is not your imagination,
Okay.
unfortunately. Yeah, from my research, I spend a lot of time talking to and interviewing men and women about their ideas about gender, about relationships, about sort of their social norms and how they live in the world. And actually, for this conversation, I am coming off of, in fact, I just returned this morning from doing a set of focus groups in Raleigh, North Carolina, with men and women, asking them how they feel about relationships, dating, sex, and the future. And things are looking grim. Both men and women suggest that they are further apart from the opposite sex than they have been in the past. They both think that the opposite sex is less interested in pairing up and settling down than they were in the past. They feel kind of uniformly pessimistic about the dating scene, and frankly about their chances of long-term partnership in the future. And from talking to young men and women, and also survey data shows this, it seems that there's like a real misunderstanding going on between both sides. Women are becoming generally more progressive, tend to be left-leaning, and are overtaking men in education and in financial well-being, frankly. While men, perhaps as a reaction, and also, of course, due to, economic factors, the lack of certain jobs, the loss of manufacturing and other jobs that used to favor men, are falling behind financially, are often falling behind educationally, and seem rather resentful of women for that reason.
Well, and Aaron, I know you talk a lot about traditional values and the erosion of traditional values. Is this just one more example of that happening, or is there something deeper going on?
It's really hard to say the cause, because if you pan back the lens a little bit and look at it, this is a global phenomenon, or certainly in much of the advanced world. So I think a lot of times we like to look at things that are going on in the United States and things that are totally unique. And like what's happening in other countries, we see that some other countries, the battle of the sexes has become worse than the United States. South Korea, which is having a sort of going out of business sale. There's so few children being born there. Has as sort of one of these countries. We also see it in the UK and Germany. And I think Christine hit part of it is there is a growing sort of political polarization as well. Maybe young men have become a little more conservative. Young women have moved far to the left. And so now you've kind of got the battle of the sexes, if you will, has become political. And if you think about a society that's been very politically polarized, the idea of like dating someone of the opposite political persuasion is kind of what it used to be. Maybe a Catholic wouldn't marry a Presbyterian or something like that. Well, now it's like a Democrat won't marry a Republican. And so when you're polarized by gender, that tends to, I think, undermine relationships. Exactly what the underlying causes are, I'm not really sure. But let me throw something out there just as sort of a provocation. I can't prove this, but since this is the Feudal Future podcast, if we put a feudalism lens on this, if you go back through history, what you would have had is a relatively small number of men at the very top with all of the resources, including many of the women, and a lot of men at the bottom without much. And you keep seeing all these stats about for much of human history. I don't remember the exact percentage. It's like 40% or more of men never procreated. Whereas you would have, polygamy, you'd have multiple men at the top. So we're sort of seeing maybe with income inequality, the same sorts of things where you have this handful of stupendous winners. And if you look at the stupendous winners of society.
You mean like Elon Musk?
I was going to say
exactly.
Elon and his
read my mind.
47 million children.
Yeah.
Right.
Wealth on a scale no one's ever had before, harems of women pumping them out like crazy. And again, the people who have that kind of money, by and large, are men. And to the extent that women have got that kind of cash, it tends to come through they inherited it or got in a divorce or something like that. So you do still have this gap, traditional gender gap at the very top of society, whereas at the bottom it's sort of inverted. And since you think about a pyramidal structure, we're kind of going back to, and of course in European feudalism there was still marriage, but when you look at this highly, highly unequal societies like that, it does tend to produce a lot of male losers at the bottom of the distribution.
Well, I'd like to hear what Christine has to say about this hypothesis. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I find it interesting, and I see some points where it makes sense, actually. I mean, first of all, one of the things that's worth noting is this gender polarization in sentiment kind of seems to be happening across social classes, but the fallout in specifically dating and marriage, like the lack of partnership, is much more visible among Americans usually, of like lower wealth strata. The sort of elite Americans, women and men who, have both gone to Ivy League colleges, both have successful careers, are doing well generally. They're complaining about dating, but they are still managing to pair up often. But when you talk to sort of Americans who have maybe some college education or no college education, who are not doing as well financially, the idea of sort of marriage and pairing up looks like a totally different thing in that range. And it's a thing that's not happening.
Well, let me throw a little bit of a curveball into this discussion. So it's interesting that when Aaron was talking about it, and especially the political side of who can date whom, it was like a two-party system in a weird kind of way. You have men and you have women. But in fact, it's a multi-party system. We now have non-binary options. To what degree has this type of broadening out of the definition of sex, how has that affected the future of male-female relationships?
That's a really interesting question. So I think it's worth pointing out still that, there are larger numbers of younger generations, Gen Z and young millennials especially, who now identify as somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum than there were in past generations. But there are still, comparatively, relatively few people identifying as, specifically trans or non-binary. Sort of the heterosexual dating market is still fairly the norm. But I've also spent a lot of time writing and researching the question of men and masculinity. And Aaron and I have actually talked about this in other spaces. But one of the things that I think may be happening with, if not the profusion of sort of like this gender non-binary or gender shift, is that it has kind of confused some definitions of masculinity or femininity. And for men especially, the sort of addition of this potential third gender, this sort of ability to switch from this to this, kind of complicates and confuses the idea of masculinity. Like, what is a man supposed to be, actually? It could have been defined as not a woman, but that there's also this sort of third mysterious thing. And I think that adds a sort of a level of discomfort sometimes to the broad sort of gender relationship proceedings, because men especially become less sure of how to act, what they're supposed to be.
Well, what's interesting is in looking at the data, I think some of it from AEI actually, the percentage of women who identify as non-binary is much larger. I mean, like I feel like if it's 30% of women are identifying this way and 8% of men, That sounds like trouble to me in the long run. Aaron, are you observing the same thing, or do you have a different take on this?
Yeah, I do think people are confused, particularly in the working class level. If, you know, I
Mm.
agree with Christine completely on that. Maybe where some of it's coming from is the number of young people who really grew up without a father.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, in a sense. So we have a 40% out of wedlock birth rate in the country, which thankfully has really peaked. It really hasn't gone up from there. And we have something like 25% of children being raised in a single parent household. And we have the highest share of children being raised in single parent households of any country in the world. And there's a kind of now infamous Pew graph of that around the country. You look at some third world kind of countries, and how is it possible they have lower single parenthood families? We have the highest, and economist Melissa Carney did a great book called The Two Parent Privilege, looking at what happens when you don't have children raised in an intact family. And even when you control for income and all of that, it's very negative. And she found, for example, some particularly negative effects on Black boys growing up in neighborhoods where there's a preponderance of non-intact families. And so I think when you don't have that male role model, someone who like models in a productive way what it means to be a man, you grow up confused. And you see this, I think you see this in J.D. Vance's memoir. You see it in Robert Henderson's kind of memoir, Troubled. So I think that it becomes difficult for people who are in kind of a dysfunctional milieu. I mean, people, I think, who, you know, listen to podcasts like this tend to imagine that, small town American life or some great repository of American virtue. These are very dysfunctional worlds. I mean, again, Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, kind of talks about dysfunction of the working class. So you have people who are growing up, in whether that be in urban environments or rural environments, and this in just highly dysfunctional communities, in terms of drugs, unstable employment, unstable family structures, many things of that nature. It's probably not a fertile environment for people to learn productive models of masculinity.
Are
And I
the
would actually say, well, I'll jump in and say also, even in kind of the not as sort of traumatized and dysregulated areas of America, or sort of class levels, you're still seeing the impacts of non-intact families. So I'm thinking again of these focus groups I am also a fellow at AEI, alongside Melissa Carney and some others, but I was doing this set of focus groups with Dan Cox, who runs
Yeah.
the Survey Center on American Life. And we were asking about gender and relationships. And sort of we would go around the table, and ask people, well, did your parents talk to you about the importance of getting married, of having a family? And most of the people we talked to, even college educated students, said they didn't. Their parents or parent talked to them a lot about getting an education, getting a job, but sort of the family question was never really brought up. The finding a partner was never really brought up. And so we asked the moderator of these focus groups to sort of press on this question, like, why do you think your parents didn't tell you about this? And around the table, you know, the majority, we did 6 focus groups over the course of 2 days. Um, Around each table, the majority of people who were there, ranging from the age of like 25 to 34, said, well, like my parents are divorced and their marriage was terrible, or I grew up, with my mom only and she managed by herself. So she didn't impress upon me the need of having a male partner or getting married to a woman and keeping things together. If anything, my parents warned me not to get tied to the wrong person or not to have kids too early. So there's this sort of like fear actually imparted about gender relations and this idea that the other sex was maybe nice to have occasionally, but definitely not necessary and shouldn't be the focus of your relationship.
Well, and it's interesting because the focus seems to be on the economics of self-sufficiency rather than, if you go back to feudal times, right, or earlier, even Victorian times, it was really all about the perpetuation of your bloodline, right, of your familial line. And now it's shifted completely toward the definition of success being economic as opposed to some other criteria.
Although I would argue that some of this may change over time, in having delved into feudalism quite a bit. One of the reasons why the Protestants triumphed over the Catholics is that a huge percentage of the Catholic population was celibate. They were about 15% were either in a monastery or in a nunnery. Whereas the Protestants really pushed having families, so demographically they did better. So what I'm wondering about long term, will it be the breeders, if you will, who are going to triumph? I assume you're familiar with Eric Kaufman's book, The Religious Will Inherit the Earth, and I thought that was a really interesting point because, I think about San Francisco and the very small number of children. Well, Marshall and I will be long gone, but my girls are going to grow up in a world where it's going to be the children of the people living in the Dallas suburbs who are going to be much more numerous than what's going to be coming out of San Francisco. So I really wonder where this dynamic goes long term, because obviously some people are getting married and having kids. They tend to have certain characteristics. Aaron, what do you think?
Well, definitely, if you look at the high fertility populations around the world, they often have some kind of religious basis or project to it. It doesn't have to be some, particularly devout faith, but there's a certain kind of dimension to it. Israel's fertility, for example, is famously high. And that's not just among the Orthodox,
the secular as well. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. It's because, but they view themselves as engaged in a project, with a sort of transcendent dimension to it. You could think also about the Amish and the Mormons. Although the Mormon fertility's fallen a lot. There's another one of these great graphs you see on the internet. It's like America, 2200, and the whole country is now Amish, except for a huge blob of Mormons.
Well, we'll have good cheese.
There are now 350 million Amish. I just saw a thing in the Times about these 8 Mennonite families that have moved to Angola. Some controversy about them moving to Angola, and part of it is when you have a lot of kids, you spread out and go places. Right. And so, the Mennonites having a lot of kids, there are going to be a lot of Mennonites showing up. And the Amish have exploded in Indiana, for example. So certainly the decline of religion, and even among the people who are religious, religion today is much more eminently focused. That it's more this worldly, less otherworldly. You don't see as many people going into monasteries or the priesthood or a lot of these things like you used to be. It's much more concerned with kind of the affairs of this world, in a sense. And Notre Dame sociologist of religion, Christian Smith, just has a new book out called Why Religion Went Obsolete. And he talks about these cultural changes that happened in the 90s and 2000s that really essentially, not that it rendered religion extinct, but kind of socially, functionally in our society, it's obsolete. We don't need it anymore. And so there's probably is a connection there. There probably is a connection, but how strong, it's hard to say.
Well, what about the world of Christine. AI? Because I think of that as the new religion that seems to be coming up, right? And the ability of AI, even today, to create a sense of faux intimacy.
Yes.
Right? And
Mark Zuckerberg providing us with the partners we need in life.
Right. I guess the question is, to what degree will people view this trend as a substitute for real relationships?
That is a fascinating question, and it's one that I think about perhaps more often than I should for my own mental health. Um, so actually, we asked this in these focus groups too. And most people, when asked, if a friend told you they had an AI girlfriend or boyfriend, what would you say to them? Everyone was like, "Oh, I'd be
Creepy.
worried. I'd be worried about them. I'd try and get them to go out in real life with me." But we're seeing a creeping acceptance of a number of these things over the years that, 5 years ago would have been seen as like very creepy and out there. I'm thinking of sort of the OnlyFans phenomenon, for instance, this site where sort of people pay to kind of interact with people who are making their own porn, basically. And 5 years ago, it was still seen as like a very
Mm,
seedy kind of thing. Today, you ask if, have you heard of OnlyFans? Like, what do you think about it? People are like, yeah, I've heard of it. And, it's an empowering way to make money. Like that sea change in sentiment happens really fast. But to the point about whether it will actually replace people and replace these relationships, be seen as a substitute, I do think that it is becoming more and more sophisticated. Um, it is possible that it can sort of mimic the relationships that people actually wish that they had. It's kind of sycophantic,
mm.
right? Like you talk to AI, it kind of always affirms you.
You get the
It doesn't
perfect man every
correct you.
time.
Exactly. It's always on your side. And that can be really comforting for people, but that's not a real relationship. That's not how relationships work. So if you're dependent on AI as a friend or to learn about relationships, you're not learning how to function with real people in the real world. So it is a crutch, but it's a crutch that won't really get you anywhere. But then one last point, actually, and this is the thing that worries me the most. Um, I have talked to men, including some sort of male friends of mine, who, started dating late or got married later. I have like one person in mind who I was talking to about this the other day, and he was saying that it was the pandemic that kind of forced him to get married, basically, because before the pandemic, he had like hobbies, he had friends, he wasn't dating that much, but like it was enough that it wasn't great, but it was fine. He had enough things that it was fine. Not, he wasn't miserable enough to, force himself to change his life. But then during the pandemic, he didn't have anyone to talk to. He didn't have a girlfriend. Like those friends had peeled away. Like he wasn't able to casually date anymore. And so when the pandemic ended, he was like, "Oh, I was miserable. Now I need to change my life. Like now I need to just like get over this hump and like meet someone and get married because I don't want to be miserable anymore." And I feel like AI, pornography, many of these sort of digital substitutes, for men especially, will end up keeping them in this place of like, I'm not miserable. It's not great, but I'm fine. Like I don't have a girlfriend, but I can watch porn. I don't have friends, but I can talk to AI. And instead of being like, "Oh, I'm miserable. I need to change my life and meet people. I need to get out there and find a girlfriend." They'll just sort of subsist in this like, uh, I'm
So
existing. It's
digital
enough.
technology as anesthetic.
Yeah, and by the way,
Yeah.
this is when I first got engaged with this, with the government of Singapore asked me to do something on why their birth rate was so low. And one of the things we found was that the men were spending enormous amount of time online. Now, it's not AI yet, but it was headed that direction. Whereas women would go out and do stuff as women together. Like I noticed very often. I don't know if you guys see the same thing, but I'll I'll go out to dinner with my wife, and I'll notice that most of the tables are mostly all women, occasionally a few guys. Um, and I wonder if this is just, something that is there any way of breaking this pattern? Because it doesn't seem like it's going to lead us to a particularly good place.
While you're thinking of the answer, I'm just thinking, what is the definition of porn in Singapore? When you've got this incredibly repressive set of social rules, I mean, is it like,
Mm.
oh, let's have a video of people spitting gum on the ground? I mean,
So perverse.
No, well, actually, I mean, what's interesting about Singapore is it's a society where women have become, like when I would work in Singapore, I would find that under the age of 40, I was working predominantly with women. Over the age of 60, it was all men. So something very dramatic, similar to what's happened in this country.
Yeah. Well, porn is kind of crazy. And I mean, I think, today's porn, which I don't consume, but all the reports are that it's extreme, very extreme content, video format, and it's having, a lot of negative effects on the men. And, a lot of women consume porn now too, a lot more than you'd think. But a lot of the men, you're hearing reports of men in their 20s with erectile dysfunction, in part coming from the just copious quantities of extreme porn that they have, they've consumed. The idea of like, any kind of ordinary relationship can't compete with hypernormal stimulus. If you think about, marrying that to sex robots or something when it gets into the future, it could be very grim. The so-called manosphere, all these kind of online men's influencer people, there's a lot to criticize about many of them. But one thing I will give them credit for, at their best, they encourage men to have agency and to avoid porn, avoid online dating, and to actually go out into the real world and try to meet women. Now, some of their purposes are nefarious for that. But again, there's no kind of, in a sense, the substance, you actually have to go out and like be willing to walk up to a woman and initiate a conversation. And a lot of guys they're just not willing to do that. And it's socially intimidating to do that. And that's why the average guy, when he can just retreat into the porn fantasy or into swiping right or whatever, it makes it so much easier. You avoid the unpleasantness. And so I think really working on people's sense of agency about their life in general is something we need to do, because it does seem like there's way too many passive kind of young men in general, quite apart from the relationship issue. They're just kind of drifting in life.
Christine, thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. I mean, to the porn issue, I think also one of the things that you see um, in surveys, in qualitative reporting, when you talk to women, they are aware that men are watching porn, and they notice in
Mm.
relationships and in their interactions with men how porn colors how men act. They talk about experiencing fear on dates
Mm.
or in intimate situations with men. The proportion of young women in Britain who say that they have been sort of choked without their consent during sex is something like a third.
Oh, God.
Um, and it's frightening and scary. And so they're like, I don't want to deal with men. I mistrust men. I don't want
Wow.
to be around them.
Mm.
And that will definitely contribute to a gender divide.
That's
Yeah, and
that's
as Aaron
shocking.
was saying, yeah, it is disturbing actually when you begin to talk to women about what their experiences with men have been, especially young women regarding sex, and you begin to understand why they're not necessarily as interested in dating. But for men, I think there is this like odd um, sort of fear and lack of agency happening too. Um, I think some of it is a little bit of a post kind of Me Too hangover. Some of it is just like a quick changing social norm that like younger men especially have not caught up to and are not sure how to act within. But there's this idea that like, well, I don't want to walk up to a woman and talk to her because like I'm afraid she'll think I'm a creep. Or, I wouldn't talk to a woman at work, because I don't want to get me too'd. I remember in my book, actually, I interviewed one guy who was like, yeah, I want to date, but I would never date at work. I would never ask someone out at work. That would be like handing someone a loaded gun. And I was like, I don't know if it's that serious. Um, but this idea that it's inappropriate or it's somehow like dangerous to speak to women in public or to actually act on and express agency means that a lot of men just don't put themselves out there and they don't meet women. And the men who then are able to overcome what seems like a social norm or, overcome that fear are often maybe more aggressive in other ways too. And that also contributes to sort of like a strange feeling.
So, this has been a great discussion. I want to leave the listeners with some strands of hope. So, so what I'd like to do is ask you first, Aaron, what what can we do as I'm not sure society can do it, but I think individuals can do it. What would be your advice on trying to correct this? What would you say to your own children to get them to not fall into this kind of trap?
Well, right now, all of sort of the formal messaging is still, I think, very kind of anti-marriage, anti-natalist in a sense. Apparently, there are still like think tanks that were sort of established by Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb guy, who
Mm,
tries to, you know, educate the educators on how to incorporate essentially population limitation into their thing. So it's like, and if you look at um, any thing in the media about marriage, how many news articles talk about a happy, normal marriage?
Or
Almost
in a
none.
movie, or yeah.
mhm.
It's like it's overwhelmingly negative, or if it's something positive, it's it's uh, it's sort of a glamorization of a niche lifestyle, like polyamory, for example. So the really society doesn't really send messages. Parents aren't telling people to get married. So I think, we need to figure out a way to educate people on the realities of life. I think a lot of people, if you ask people, young people, would you like to get married and have kids? Is that like, oh, I think a lot of them would still say, yeah, I kind of like to have that. But nobody, especially when you're young, you don't really understand like what it means to be 75 years old, single, no kids. Like you can't even relate to that. Uh, so I think we're kind of a little bit flying blind. But the key is, I think, talking to people about what you get from getting married. And Brad Wilcox, the sociologist, has all the stats. Oh no, you might live longer. You'll probably have more money, all that stuff. And and then also like helping people understand that it's like you can't get into a college today the way I got into college, which was like, oh, it's my senior year. Maybe I should send off some applications somewhere, kind of thing. You know, we have to treat getting married. Young people have to treat getting married the same way they treat getting into the college of their dreams. You have to have intentionality. You have to work on it. You have to work on your own product, your own resume, your own like, your own equivalent of test scores and GPA. You have to do what it takes. You can't just say, well, it'll happen. You know, Nobody would say that about a career. Nobody would say that about getting into college. The other things that matter in life, like we realize we have to have high intentionality in a very high degree of difficulty world. And so I think, kind of proactively getting young people just understand like here's what you have to do, and like helping them like, you know, helping bring them along and like modeling healthy lifestyles and agency and things of that nature, is important.
Christine, last
Last
word
word,
for you.
yes.
Yeah, I would second everything that Aaron says. I think he's totally on the mark there. Um, I do think that a lot of young people still would like a partner, would like to get married, but are not sure how to get there. They have this idea that they'll get married someday, but like, how do I ask someone out? Like, what are men and women looking for? How do I behave with other people? They feel like they have to come up with these norms on their own, which takes time. And then sometimes it takes too much time and you've kind of aged out of what you wanted. So I think this just like being realistic about, marriage doesn't just happen, relationships don't just happen. You have to sort of go outside, get off the apps, talk to people, try that out, is important. And yeah, I would also say, I've noticed this in the media too, especially in women's media, you know, when there are conversations about marriage, it's so often, a divorce memoir or, my marriage is terrible because my husband X. And in talking to actually other female writers who, are married and are happy, many of them are like, I feel like it's kind of it's kind of passe or like uncool to be like, oh, I like my husband a lot. Like I like my kids actually. They didn't ruin my career. Um, and yeah, I think being more open about how marriage can be just like normal and nice, not necessarily a disaster, not necessarily something that will set you back or take you off track, but actually that could propel you forward, would be really important. And then I think for adults generally, one of the crises that we're seeing with young people of both genders, but especially men, is just a crisis of role models. Um, how do I become a man? Like, what are the things I need to do to get through life? I wish my parents or somebody would just tell me what to do. I think that older people actually need to take agency themselves. And like if there are young men or young women or single people in your community who you see are floundering or who you notice are great, but they're alone, like you can step in and invite them over to your house, to have dinner with your family to see what that looks like, or introduce them to somebody who you think they might like. That sort of help from above, as it were, can be the push that younger people need.
Well, this has just been a fascinating conversation.
And we will revisit this for sure.
Yeah, and just we're in such a weird time, where if you look back to feudal times, we had many institutions were reinforcing what acceptable, what norms should be, what integrity looks like. And now we're kind of adrift with a lot of different messages that are contradictory. So being able to understand the nature of that is something that you've helped us bring out today. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You were really terrific. Thank you.
And thanks for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
The feudal future.